The housekeeper, Mrs. Venables, drew herself up with the particular stiffness of a woman who had spent 4 decades maintaining standards in a house that seemed determined to disappoint her. Her grey hair, arranged with mathematical precision beneath a white cap, did not so much as tremble as she met Whimsy's gaze. "Mr. Ashworth kept to his routine most precisely, sir," she said, her voice carrying the measured cadence of one accustomed to being obeyed. "Every evening at 9:30, he would retire to the drawing-room with his brandy and his papers. The curtains were drawn, as they have been drawn every evening for the past 20 years, ever since the road was widened, and the lamp-posts brought insufferably close to the windows. Mr. Ashworth disliked being observed whilst he worked." The emphasis upon the final word hung in the air like a challenge, and Whimsy found himself warming to Mrs. Venables considerably. Here, at least, was a woman who understood that precision in domestic matters frequently concealed precision in other, more sinister endeavours. "Observed from without, you mean?" Whimsy inquired, his tone suggesting mere idle curiosity of the sort one might deploy when discussing the meridian of the Suez. "Not perhaps observed from within. One notes that the drawing-room curtains, whilst drawn, are not drawn with complete opacity. There remains, if one squints in precisely the correct manner, a gap of perhaps 3 inches along the eastern edge, where the fabric has failed to achieve total closure. Either Mr. Ashworth was remarkably careless about such matters, or someone has taken considerable pains to ensure that the curtains appeared drawn whilst permitting observation from the corridor. Bates, you discovered the body this morning. Did you enter the drawing-room as was your custom, or did you observe something unusual that prompted your entrance?" The valet, a man of perhaps 50 years with the sort of face that suggested he had witnessed considerably more than any man Orton chosen to forget most of it, stepped forward with the mechanical precision of an automaton. "I brought Mr. Ashworth's morning tea at 7 o'clock, sir, as I have done for 15 years, he said, his words tumbling out with the rehearsed quality of testimony already delivered to the constabulary. The door was ajar, perhaps 6 inches, which was most irregular. Mr. Ashworth invariably kept it closed. I knocked, receiving no response, and upon entering, I observed him upon the floor beside the desk. The paperweight was nearby. I did not touch anything, but proceeded immediately to inform Mrs. Venables, who notified Constable Harrington. And the French door giving onto the terrace?" Whimsy pressed, moving toward the window with the purposeful stride of a man who had suddenly decided that the rain-sodden garden merited closer inspection. "Locked from within, I am informed, with the key discovered in the deceased's pocket. One wonders whether Mr. Ashworth was in the habit of carrying such a key upon his person during his evening labours, or whether the key was deposited there after his demise, placed by someone with an intimate knowledge of his habits and an encyclopedic understanding of theatrical misdirection. Bates, when you entered the drawing-room this morning, was that key visible upon the carpet, near the body, or was it already secure within the pocket?" A faint hesitation flickered across the valet's features, so minute that anyone lacking Whimsy's particular talent for observing the infinitesimal shifts in human behaviour would have missed it entirely. "The key was in the pocket, sir," Bates replied, though his voice had acquired a certain metallic quality, as though he were reciting from a script he had committed to memory but no longer entirely believed. "I observed it when I went to examine whether Mr. Ashworth possessed signs of life. Young James, the footman, had begun to shift his weight from one foot to the other with increasing nervousness, and Whimsy's attention, having completed its circuit of the drawing-room threshold, now turned toward this younger man with the focused intensity of a naturalist who has observed an insect, exhibiting behaviour inconsistent with its species. "You," Whimsy remarked, with the particular tone he deployed when addressing individuals he suspected of knowing considerably more than they were admitting, appear to be harbouring information of some significance. "One notes your uniform is damp upon the left shoulder, suggesting you have either been caught in the rain during duties in the garden, or you have been standing beside someone else who was similarly exposed. Furthermore, your shoes, whilst ostensibly clean, bear traces of mud of a particular reddish hue consistent with the soil found only in the east garden near the servants' entrance. Would you care to enlighten us regarding your morning activities? Or shall we allow Constable Harrington to discover them through the more laborious process of questioning every member of the household? Mrs. Venables' jaw tightened fractionally, and even Bates appeared to experience a momentary lapse in his professional composure. Edmund Ashworth, visible through the doorway, had gone quite remarkably pale, his fingers gripping the mantelpiece with the desperation of a man confronting his ultimate undoing. Whimsy, observing these reactions with the satisfaction of a conductor who had successfully brought his orchestra into precise harmony, allowed a lengthy silence to develop, broken only by the percussion of rain upon the windows and the distant ticking of the hall clock, which he noted with some interest, appeared to run approximately 4 minutes fast, compared to the pocket watch he had consulted upon his arrival. James cleared his throat with the delicate precision of a man who had decided that silence, whilst infinitely preferable, was no longer a viable option. "I was taking the ash bins to the garden incinerator this morning, sir," he began, his voice acquiring that particular tremulous quality adopted by individuals engaged in what they hoped would be accepted as truthfulness. "Around 6:30, before the household was properly stirring. The mud upon my shoes is from the path, which runs somewhat boggy after the rain we've had these past days. As for my shoulder, well, I confess I did venture out to the terrace at approximately 6 o'clock, as I often do to check the state of the early morning. The east wind carries the rain rather directly toward the terrace doors, you see." "How very attentive of you," Whimsy remarked, his tone suggesting precisely the opposite. One would scarcely expect a footman to possess such meteorological solicitude at 6 o'clock in the morning, unless of course one suspected that footman had been summoned to the terrace by someone, or unless that footman possessed some particular reason to observe the comings and goings in that vicinity. The French door, I take it, was locked at that hour, and yet, assuming one wished to exit the drawing-room during the night, one would require either the key or a lockpick, neither of which appears to have been discovered in the deceased's possession save for the former, which was found precisely where one would expect to find it had one been attempting to construct the illusion of an impossible crime. "Edmund, do step forward if you would. I find myself curious regarding your own morning activities." Edmund Ashworth emerged from the morning room with the reluctant gait of a man approaching the executioner's block. His youth, he could not have been more than 28 or 29, rendered pathetic by the manner in which guilt and fear had conspired to hollow out his features. "I was in my room," he said, the words tumbling forth with the desperate speed of one who had rehearsed this statement until it had lost all semblance of natural speech. "I heard nothing. I saw nothing. I retired at 11 o'clock and did not emerge until 8, when I was informed of my uncle's death. Your room being located in the east wing, as I understand it," Whimsy continued, moving toward the staircase with the thoughtful air of a man contemplating architectural layout, quite distant from the drawing-room, which occupies the western end of the ground floor. "The soundproofing between the two wings is rather remarkable, I should think. One might murder someone with considerable vigor and create scarcely a whisper of disturbance in the east wing. And yet, the hall clock, as I have observed, runs 4 minutes fast. Tell me, does your room possess a clock? And if so, does it run with equal deviation from the correct time?" Mrs. Venables had begun to exhibit signs of considerable discomfort, her fingers fidgeting with the keys that hung at her waist with an agitation that suggested she was contemplating either an escape or a confession. Bates maintained his stance with admirable rigidity, though his eyes had acquired a peculiar glassiness that suggested his mind was engaged in rapid calculation of some sort. It was Mrs. Venables, however, who eventually surrendered to the pressure of Whimsy's relentless observation, her voice emerging as though dragged forth against her better judgment. "The east wing clocks run true," she said. "ID, quietly. Mr. Ashworth had them adjusted 5 years ago, when young Mr. Edmund came to live with us. He said the precise timekeeping helped maintain discipline in that part of the house. The hall clock, the drawing-room clock, and the library clock all run fast. Mr. Ashworth preferred it so. He said it kept people moving punctually, prevented tardiness. He never explained precisely why he required the master's wing to be ahead of his nephew's wing." Whimsy smiled. an expression of such genuine pleasure that it transformed his face into something approaching boyish, despite the silver threading through his dark hair. "Control," he said softly, as though speaking to himself. "That is the operative word here." Mr. Ashworth maintained control not merely through inheritance and discipline, but through the manipulation of time itself. How delightfully baroque. One wonders whether the young Mr. Edmund understood quite what psychological pressure he was operating under, or whether the simple fact of being 5 minutes behind the rest of the household had gradually worn upon his sense of reality until the distinction between fairness and injustice became somewhat irrelevant. "Sir, I really must protest," Edmund began, but Whimsy raised a hand with an air of such casual authority that the boy fell silent as though a switch had been operated. "Not yet, my dear fellow," Whimsy said, his attention turning toward the drawing-room door, which he now proceeded to examine with meticulous care, running his fingers along the frame, the hinges, and the lock mechanism itself. "The paperweight, I understand, was discovered approximately 18 inches from the corpse. One wonders whether the gentleman who delivered the blow, assuming it was indeed delivered rather than self-inflicted following some catastrophic crisis of conscience, possessed the left or right hand as their dominant appy. The wound, I am given to understand by the preliminary medical examination, was struck from left to right, which would suggest either a left-handed assailant or a right-handed assailant positioned to the victim's left. And then, of course, there is the matter of the curtain gap, which remains not merely curious but actively troublesome to any theory of impossible entry." Whimsy stepped into the drawing-room proper, his movements deliberate and unhurried, and what greeted him was precisely the sort of mise-en-scene that murder scenes typically presented when examined by constables of limited imaginative capacity. The Aubusson carpet bore its dark stain with the tragic dignity of a stage backdrop, and the desk, a rather magnificent 18th-century construction of mahogany and gilt, stood precisely where one would expect a desk to stand, positioned at an angle that allowed the occupant to observe both the door and the French door simultaneously. The paperweight lay where it had been discovered, though Whimsy noted with some interest that it had been moved at least twice since the initial investigation, the dust marks upon the carpet revealing the truth more eloquently than any police report. He picked up the marble object with a handkerchief, noting its considerable heft and the precise distribution of Ashworth's blood upon its upper surface. A left-handed blow, executed from approximately the 9 o'clock position relative to the seated man, delivered with sufficient force to suggest either considerable strength or considerable rage, or perhaps most tellingly, considerable familiarity with violence. "The window treatment is what fascinates me," Whimsy remarked, turning his attention to the French door, which occupied the eastern wall of the drawing-room, its curtains drawn in that deceptively complete manner that James had already admitted permitted observation. From the corridor, one draws curtains for privacy, naturally. One also draws curtains to conceal what occurs within a room from external observation. But one rarely draws curtains whilst leaving a deliberate gap, unless one intends that gap to serve a specific function. The gap is not random. It is positioned precisely at eye level for an observer standing in the corridor outside. Furthermore, and this is where matters become rather interesting, the curtain fabric itself bears traces of having been recently disturbed, as though someone had stood with their body pressed against the heavy cloth, creating wrinkles and creases inconsistent with ordinary drawn curtains. Mrs. Venables, during the ordinary course of her housekeeping duties, when precisely would she have cause to open these particular curtains? The housekeeper had followed Whimsy into the drawing-room with the reluctant tread of a woman approaching her own interrogation. "Every morning at 7 o'clock, sir, and every evening at dusk," she replied, her composure beginning to exhibit visible fissures. Mr. Ashworth was most particular about such matters. The drawing-room required precisely 45 seconds to open the curtains and 45 seconds to close them, not a moment more or less. He said it prevented dust from settling excessively upon the furnishings. 45 seconds, Whimsy repeated, his tone suggesting he had just received confirmation of something he had long suspected. A very specific interval. One wonders whether Mr. Ashworth timed this operation himself, or whether he had entrusted the task to someone whose own temporal precision had been thoroughly tested by 5 years of living beneath clocks that ran conspicuously ahead of reality. Bates, when you entered this room this morning and discovered the body, did the curtains appear precisely as they do now? Or had they been disturbed? Aye. Any manner? The valet's hesitation this time was considerably more pronounced, his fingers clenching and unclenching with an agitation that suggested internal debate of some significance. The curtains were slightly more open, sir, he admitted finally, his voice reduced to something barely above a whisper. I closed them, as I have done every morning when I discovered Mr. Ashworth had left them imprecisely arranged during the night. I assumed he had been disturbed, or had risen during the evening and failed to restore them to proper position. It is a habit of mine, you see, to maintain standards even after a tragedy has occurred. How admirably devoted to duty, Wimsey observed, though something in his tone suggested he found this devotion considerably less admirable than his words implied. And the French door lock? You did not observe it when you entered, I presume. One would need to have examined the door rather closely to perceive that the key was absent from the lock itself. The key would need to be inserted from within, you see, and then turned, and then removed, a process requiring perhaps 30 seconds, assuming no particular urgency or trembling of the hands. Tell me, Bates, during your tenure as valet to the late Mr. Ashworth, did you ever observe the gentleman carrying that key upon his person? Always, sir, Bates replied. Mr. Ashworth kept it in the pocket of his dressing gown, which hung always in his dressing room. The dressing gown was his personal garment, and none of the other servants were permitted to touch it. He would don it immediately upon retiring to the drawing-room for his evening work, and the dressing-room, Wimsey pressed, is located where precisely in relation to the drawing-room. Adjacent, sir. One might pass from one to the other through an interior door that is kept locked save when Mr. Ashworth requires access. Wimsey's smile widened fractionally, and he turned toward Edmund with an expression of such penetrating clarity that the young man actually took a step backward. Now we are approaching something approaching coherence, Wimsey remarked. A man who controlled not merely the financial destinies of his household, but the very passage of time itself. A man who possessed separate wings for different members of his household, who maintained locked doors between chambers, who carried keys in specific pockets of specific garments. A man, in short, who was engaged in maintaining such rigorous control over his environment that any deviation from his prescribed order would have registered as a profound and intolerable violation. And then, one evening, that control was shattered most permanently. The question that now occupies my mind is whether the shattering occurred at precisely 9:30 in the evening, as one would ordinarily assume, or whether it occurred at an entirely different hour altogether, and someone has simply been rather clever about the matter of time. Edmund had begun to tremble quite visibly now, his face acquiring a greyish pallor that suggested either imminent illness or the dawning recognition that his carefully constructed deceptions were unravelling with alarming rapidity. "I don't understand what you're implying, Lord Peter," he said, his voice cracking with the strain of attempting to maintain innocence, whilst every fibre of his being screamed guilt. "I had nothing to do with my uncle's death, nothing whatsoever. Yes, he disinherited me. Yes, I despised the man for his tyranny, for his psychological cruelty, for the manner in which he used control as a weapon against anyone unfortunate enough to fall within his orbit. But I did not kill him." "Of course you didn't," Wimsey agreed, the casual manner of his assent causing Edmund to blink in apparent confusion. "Duh! Ich is precisely what makes this matter so extraordinarily interesting. Because if you did not kill him, then someone else did, and that someone else possessed not merely the motive and opportunity, but the intimate knowledge of Mr. Ashworth's habits necessary to construct what initially appears to be an impossible crime. One notes that you have been standing directly beside Mrs. Venables since I began my examination of the drawing-room. A curious proximity for a young man who claims no involvement in the death of his uncle. One would expect a genuinely innocent person to maintain a certain distance from those implicated in crime, much as one might instinctively step away from a flame. And yet you remain, which suggests either remarkable courage or remarkable complicity of a passive sort. Mrs. Venables had gone entirely white, her composure shattering with the abruptness of a dropped porcelain figurine. "Lord Peter, I beg you," she said, her voice emerging as something between a whisper and a whimper. The boy had nothing to do with it. "You must understand, Mr. Ashworth was a cruel man, not merely demanding but deliberately, consciously cruel. He derived pleasure from the suffering of others. When young Mr. Edmund married Miss Catherine, Mr. Ashworth did not simply disinherit him. He arranged for the girl's father to learn of certain indiscretions committed by the gentleman years before Edmund's marriage. He ensured that the young couple would be socially ostracized. He intercepted their correspondence. He made it his personal mission to torment them both." "How remarkably vindictive," Whimsy observed, his tone suggesting he found such behavior neither remarkable nor particularly surprising. "And yet this vendetta, for that is what it was, I presume, extended over 5 years? A considerable investment of emotional energy for a man who claimed to value discipline and, dar above all other considerations. One wonders whether Mr. Ashworth derived satisfaction from the process, or whether the satisfaction had long since palled, leaving only the ritualistic continuation of cruelty for its own sake. But we are digressing. The question that remains is not whether Mr. Ashworth deserved his fate. Clearly, from Mrs. Venables' account, he was a thoroughly unpleasant human being. The question is who delivered that fate, and how they managed to accomplish it whilst remaining unobserved. Bates had begun to exhibit signs of considerable strain, his professional composure finally cracking beneath the weight of Whimsy's relentless investigation. "It was an accident," he said suddenly, the words spilling forth with the desperation of a man no longer able to maintain his burden of silence. "Mr. Ashworth struck her quite brutally when she attempted to remonstrate with him regarding his treatment of young Mr. Edmund. She lost her footing, fell against the marble hearth, and when she endeavored to rise, Mr. Ashworth became enraged and attempted to strike her again. She defended herself. The paperweight was upon the desk. She reached for it. There was a struggle. He fell. She did not mean she, Whimsy inquired, though his tone suggested he had already assembled the relevant facts into their proper configuration. "Not Mrs. Venables, I presume, though she possesses sufficient motive. Someone younger, then. Someone with access to the drawing-room during the evening hours. Someone whom Mr. Ashworth would admit without suspicion. Someone whose presence would not be remarked upon by the servants. That would be Miss Catherine, would it not? Edmund's wife, whom Mr. Ashworth had been tormenting for 5 years, and upon whom he had finally inflicted some physical violence sufficiently severe as to overcome her natural reluctance to commit murder." Edmund made a strangled sound, something between a sob and a shout of denial, but Mrs. Venables simply closed her eyes as though acknowledging the inevitable exposure of secrets she had guarded at considerable personal cost. "She came through the garden," the housekeeper said quietly, "through the French door. The boy had given her the key weeks ago during one of his clandestine visits. He had made a duplicate, you see, understanding that his wife was trapped in a situation of considerable psychological torment and wishing her to possess means of escape should matters become unbearable. On that evening, matters became unbearable. Mr. Ashworth had received a letter from a gentleman of questionable reputation containing photographs, intimate photographs taken years before Edmund's marriage. He intended to send them to Edmund to complete the destruction of their union. Catherine could not permit it. She entered through the French door. She confronted him. He struck her. The rest followed as surely as night follows day. Whimsy nodded slowly, his expression betraying neither satisfaction nor moral judgment, and the curtain gap remained deliberately open, he continued, so that Mrs. Venables, standing in the corridor at the precise moment the deed occurred, could observe that young Mr. Edmund had not committed the crime himself. She became, in effect, a witness to an accident. She could testify, if necessary, that Edmund was innocent. She could protect the boy she had raised from infancy, regardless of the consequences to herself. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the windows, and in the drawing-room of Ashworth Manor, time seemed to have achieved a peculiar stasis, as though the household had been suspended in amber whilst the world outside continued its ordinary progression. Edmund had sunk into the nearest chair, his face buried in his hands. His shoulders heaving with the violence of suppressed emotion. Mrs. Venables stood with the rigid composure of a woman who had finally relinquished her burden and discovered that the weight, whilst removed from her shoulders, had merely been transferred to her conscience. Bates remained motionless, his confession having apparently exhausted whatever reserves of revelation he possessed. "Where is Mrs. Edmund at present?" Wimsey inquired, his tone suggesting he was asking about nothing more consequential than the location of a mislaid book. "I presume she did not simply vanish into the gardens following the regrettable incident. One would require a rather specific set of circumstances to permit such an exit without leaving traces. The mud upon young James's shoulder, I should think, came not from his own activities, but from his assistance in helping her to depart. He would have been stationed outside, would he not, prepared to offer aid should matters deteriorate beyond the point of natural resolution. James, who had maintained a studied appearance of detachment throughout the preceding discussion, finally abandoned his pretense of innocence. "She's in the gamekeeper's cottage," he said quietly. "About 2 miles north, on the estate boundary. Mrs. Venables arranged it. She's been there since this morning, waiting to see whether anyone would discover the truth, or whether the constabulary would simply arrest young Mr. Edmund and close the matter. Mrs. Venables believed, we all believed, that there was a possibility Lord Peter Wimsey might be called in, and that if anyone possessed the wit to see beyond the obvious, it would be him." Wimsey's expression shifted into something approximating amusement, an alteration so subtle that one might easily miss it if one were not watching with particular attention. "How extraordinarily touching," he remarked. "A conspiracy of loyalty, orchestrated by a woman who understood that the machinery of justice, once set in motion, tends to grind toward the most convenient rather than the most truthful conclusion. Mrs. Venables placed considerable faith in my intellectual capacities and my disinclination toward accepting the obvious solution. A dangerous gambit, but then again Mrs. Venables strikes me as a woman accustomed to dangerous gambits. Tell me, did you compose the telegrams yourself, or did you require assistance in ensuring that Pembroke would contact me with sufficient urgency to justify my immediate arrival?" Mrs. Venables opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "I wrote to Mr. Pembroke 3 days ago," she finally admitted, "before the death occurred. I wrote explaining that should anything unfortunate happen to Mr. Ashworth, I was requesting that Mr. Pembroke contact you specifically, that I had observed your work in the Blackfriars matter, and felt confident that you alone possessed sufficient perception to see beyond surface appearances. Mr. Pembroke thought me morbid, pessimistic. He could not have anticipated that Mr. Ashworth would expire with such convenient timing," Wimsey interrupted gently, "or that the circumstances of his demise would appear precisely as they have appeared. Mrs. Venables, your faith in my abilities is gratifying, but it does not alter the fundamental difficulty. A woman has committed what, by the legal definition, constitutes murder. The provocation was real, the cruelty was documented, the violence was self-defense. But the law is not particularly sympathetic to such nuances. Mr. Ashworth struck her first, yes, but she struck him last and harder. The paperweight, once employed as a weapon, transforms self-defense into something considerably more ambiguous." Edmund raised his face from his hands, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "Then you mean to have her arrested, despite everything, despite the cruelty, the systematic humiliation, the deliberate psychological torture. I mean to do precisely nothing at this moment," Wimsey said, moving toward the windows and observing the rain-soaked garden beyond with the contemplative air of a man considering abstract philosophy. "Constable Harrington is currently occupied with interviewing the servants in the kitchen, attempting to construct a case against you based upon circumstantial evidence and motive. He will eventually discover that you possess neither the means nor the opportunity to have committed this crime, and he will then cast about for alternative suspects. He will, I suspect, eventually arrive at the conclusion that the locked room aspect of this affair suggests either supernatural intervention or a conspiracy of considerable complexity. At that juncture, my dear fellow, you might discover that appearing utterly baffled but ultimately cooperative proves considerably more advantageous than providing him with additional suspects to pursue. "You're not going to report it?" Mrs. Venables whispered, her voice scarcely audible above the sound of the rain. "You're not going to tell the constabulary what occurred?" "I am going to do something far more interesting," Whimsy replied, turning back toward the assembled household with an expression of urbane detachment. "I am going to examine the precise timing of events with considerably more rigor than Constable Harrington possesses. I am going to observe that the hall clock runs 4 minutes fast, whilst the east wing clocks run true. I am going to note that a man's death at 9:30 in the evening, according to the hall clock, might actually have occurred at 9:26, according to a more accurate timepiece. I am going to discover that a certain footman, having established an alibi that begins at 6 o'clock, cannot account for his movements between 7 and 8 o'clock, a period that coincides quite precisely with when a particular incident might have occurred. And I am going to suggest to Constable Harrington that perhaps the matter requires rather more intensive investigation than his initial cursory examination has provided." Bates had begun to comprehend the elegant architecture of Whimsy's solution, and something remarkably approaching hope flickered across his weathered features. "You mean to suggest," the valet said slowly, "that young Mr. Edmund might have possessed sufficient time, were the clocks sufficiently inaccurate, to have committed the deed himself? That the matter might be constructed in such a fashion as to implicate him rather than—" "I mean to suggest nothing of the sort," Whimsy interrupted with characteristic precision. "I mean to construct a narrative so thoroughly bewildering, so replete with temporal inconsistencies and alternative interpretations, that any magistrate examining the evidence would find himself obliged to conclude that the case remains fundamentally uncertain. When cases become sufficiently uncertain, you see, they tend to be dismissed through want of compelling proof. Constable Harrington will discover that James was not where he claimed to be at 6 o'clock in the morning. James will then provide a revised account, explaining that he was actually engaged in some minor indiscretion, a clandestine meeting with a housemaid, perhaps, or an unauthorized excursion to the village. This revised testimony will cast doubt upon his reliability as a witness. The case against Edmund will crumble accordingly, and the constabulary will find themselves obliged to conduct a far more thorough investigation, during which time certain evidence may become lost or misplaced, certain witnesses may revise their recollections, and certain crucial detail ls may prove too ambiguous to withstand rigorous scrutiny. Edmund was now staring at Whimsy with an expression compounded equally of gratitude and incomprehension. "But that's making a mockery of justice itself," the young man protested weakly. "Surely the truth ought to matter more than—" "The truth," Whimsy said, his tone acquiring the philosophical cadence he adopted when discussing matters of genuine importance, "is frequently a far more complex and subjective entity than the law presumes. The law seeks facts, timelines, physical evidence. The machinery of justice requires certainty, or at least the appearance of certainty. But human motivation, human frailty, human suffering, these do not fit neatly into the categories that magistrates prefer. Your wife was trapped in a situation of deliberate psychological torment. Your uncle was deliberately tormenting her, employing means both subtle and brutally direct. She defended herself against physical violence. Did she strike harder than necessary? Possibly. Did she strike with murderous intent? That remains considerably less certain. And does a legal system designed to punish calculated murders function appropriately when applied to a woman acting in desperate self-defense against systematic cruelty? That, my dear Edmund, is a question I find myself profoundly unwilling to answer with anything resembling certainty." Mrs. Venables had begun to weep quietly, the first genuine emotional display she had permitted herself throughout the interview. "You have a daughter, don't you, Lord Peter?" she asked suddenly, her voice trembling with the force of her emotion. "I read about you in the newspapers. They said you were involved in a matter concerning your sister-in-law, that you had gone to considerable lengths to protect her. This is no different, is it? Catherine is a girl, Not much older than your own nieces, I should think. She was being systematically destroyed by a man who enjoyed inflicting pain. She acted in desperation. Whimsy's expression, which had maintained its customary urbane detachment throughout the preceding discussion, underwent a subtle alteration, a tightening about the eyes that suggested Mrs. Venables had touched upon something genuinely sensitive. He turned away from her, his attention returning to the rain-soaked windows, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quality of genuine weariness. "You understand me rather too well, Mrs. Venables," he said quietly. "Constable Harrington will arrive within the quarter hour, expecting to find circumstances substantially clarified by my investigation. Instead, he will find them considerably more muddled. I shall explain, with considerable technical precision, the manner in which the various clocks throughout Ashworth Manor have been maintained at different intervals, creating a chronological impossibility that renders any definitive timeline impossible to establish. I shall note, with regretful emphasis, that the forensic examination of the paperweight has been compromised by Bates's well-intentioned but fundamentally destructive attempts to maintain household standards. I shall suggest, with appropriate scholarly humility, that the French door lock may have been tampered with by persons unknown, and that its present configuration may not reflect its state at the time of Mr. Ashworth's demise." "And James?" Edmund asked, his voice emerging with characteristic uncertainty. "What becomes of James?" "James will provide a revised account of his morning activities," Whimsy continued, his tone suggesting he had already composed the narrative in his mind. "He will admit to a minor impropriety that will sufficiently embarrass both himself and the household to discourage further questioning regarding his precise movements. The constabulary will accept this explanation, as it will provide them with a convenient explanation for the inconsistencies in his original testimony. In the absence of any conclusive physical evidence or credible witness testimony, the matter will become increasingly problematic to prosecute. Within a fortnight, the case will be quietly closed for want of sufficient evidence, and life will resume its ordinary course, albeit with certain participants possessing a considerably enhanced appreciation for the fragility of justice and the arbitrary nature of legal culpability." Whimsy turned back toward the assembled household, his expression returning to its customary ironic detachment. "Now, if you would be so kind as to fetch Constable Harrington from the kitchen, I believe it is time to provide him with a narrative so thoroughly elaborate, so replete with technical minutiae, and so fundamentally bewildering that he will find himself quite unable to determine whether I am assisting his investigation or deliberately obscuring it. The beauty of such matters, you see, is that ambiguity itself becomes a form of protection." Constable Harrington arrived in the drawing-room with the ponderous deliberation of a man whose understanding of criminal investigation had been acquired through decades of dealing with agricultural disputes, sheep rustling, and the occasional drunken altercation outside the village public house. He was a large man, rendered larger by the weight of his official authority, and his expression suggested he had already determined the matter's resolution and viewed any further investigation as merely the tedious formality of assembling sufficient evidence to satisfy the magistrate. His notebook was already positioned, his pencil at the ready, and his entire demeanor conveyed the unmistakable impression that he regarded Whimsy's involvement as either helpful confirmation of his own deductions or an impediment to the swift conclusion of a disagreeable duty. "Lord Peter," Harrington began, with the cautious respect afforded to titled individuals by those accustomed to deference, but uncertain of its precise degree, "I understand you've been examining the scene. I expect you've arrived at conclusions consistent with what seems fairly evident. Young Mr. Edmund here possessed both motive and opportunity. The locked room, the key in the deceased's pocket, the time frame during which the servants report, hearing nothing, all points toward the nephew." "How admirably direct," Whimsy remarked, his tone suggesting that directness, whilst occasionally useful, frequently proved counterproductive when applied to matters of genuine complexity. One admires such confidence in the face of considerable circumstantial ambiguity. However, I find myself obliged to present certain complications that may require your further consideration. For instance, The matter of temporal precision in this household has become rather vexingly apparent. The hall clock runs 4 minutes fast, whilst the east wing clocks maintain accurate time. This discrepancy alone creates a chronological impossibility regarding the established timeline of events. Harrington's expression underwent a subtle transformation, shifting from satisfied certainty toward something approximating confusion. "The clocks run at different rates?" he repeated, as though the concept were so foreign to his experience that it required translation into comprehensible language. Why would a man maintain clocks that run at different speeds? "Control," Whimsy explained, moving toward the mantelpiece clock, which displayed the time as 11 minutes past 11, despite the actual time being precisely 7 minutes past 11, according to Whimsy's pocket watch. Mr. Ashworth appears to have maintained the master's wing clocks ahead of those in the east wing where his nephew resided. A psychological mechanism, I should think, designed to create a perpetual sense of temporal displacement in young Mr. Edmund's mind. A rather ingenious method of establishing dominance when one considers the matter with appropriate attention to psychological subtlety. "But what bearing does this have on the murder?" Harrington asked, his voice carrying an undertone of defensiveness, as though he sensed that his carefully constructed case was beginning to fracture beneath scrutiny. "Everything," Whimsy replied, though his tone suggested that explaining precisely what everything meant would require rather more effort than he was presently inclined to expend. "If Mr. Ashworth died at 9:30 according to the hall clock, which is what the preliminary investigation assumes, then he actually died at 9:26 according to accurate time. However, if we consider that young Mr. Edmund's perception of time was systematically distorted by the 5-year exposure to clocks running 4 minutes fast in certain areas of the house and true time in others, we must contemplate the psychological possibility that the nephew's own temporal reckoning might be equally distorted. Furthermore, the servant's accounts of hearing nothing during the relevant period must be considered in light of the drawing-room's remarkable soundproofing. A violent altercation might easily have transpired without generating sufficient acoustic disturbance to register in the servants' quarters. Bates had stepped forward at precisely the correct moment, offering a revised account of his morning discovery that incorporated just sufficient new detail to create the impression of incomplete recollection rather than deliberate obfuscation. Upon reflection, Constable, the valet explained with admirable hesitation, "I believe I may have been inaccurate regarding the precise position of the paperweight. I was considerably distressed upon discovering Mr. Ashworth's condition, and my initial observations may not have been as precise as I subsequently reported them to you. I believe the paperweight was actually closer to the desk, perhaps 2 feet rather than 18 inches, which might suggest a rather different sequence of events than initially reconstructed." James, recognizing his cue with the practiced timing of one who had been thoroughly briefed, now provided his revised account of the morning's activities. "I confess, Constable, that I was not engaged in the duties I initially described," he said, his face flushing with the appropriate degree of embarrassment. "I had arranged a clandestine meeting with Miss Abigail, the scullery maid, in the garden at 6 o'clock. We met for perhaps 15 minutes, and during that time I was engaged in activities that, whilst innocent in nature, would have brought considerable disapprobation upon Miss Abigail had they been discovered. I failed to mention this meeting initially out of concern for her reputation and position in the household." Whimsy nodded approvingly at this transparent fabrication, which served its purpose of providing sufficient alternative explanation for James's muddy shoes and damp shoulder, whilst simultaneously discrediting his testimony regarding his morning movements. Harrington was now visibly struggling to maintain his original theory in the face of these complications, his pencil moving uncertainly across his notebook as he attempted to incorporate these new details into his existing framework. "The matter has become considerably more complex than your initial assessment suggested, Constable," Whimsy observed, moving toward the French door and examining its lock mechanism with renewed attention. "The key's presence in the deceased's pocket may indicate either that he locked the door from within or that someone placed it there subsequently. The gap in the curtains may have been deliberate or accidental. The precise timing of death given the temporal inconsistencies throughout the household, remains fundamentally impossible to establish with certainty. I should think that before proceeding further with charges against young Mr. Edmund, a considerably more thorough investigation would be warranted. Constable Harrington's face had acquired a greyish pallor reminiscent of old plaster, and his pencil ceased its tentative movement across the notebook's pages entirely. "You're suggesting," he said slowly, "that the case is more complex than initially apparent, that the evidence, whilst appearing to point toward young Mr. Edmund, may in fact be insufficient to support criminal charges?" "I am suggesting nothing whatsoever," Wimsey replied with characteristic precision. "I am merely observing that the available evidence admits of multiple interpretations and that any prosecution based upon the current state of investigation would likely founder upon the rocks of reasonable doubt. A defense barrister of even moderate competence could construct an alternative narrative that would render your case substantially less compelling than it currently appears. The temporal inconsistencies alone would provide sufficient grounds for serious questioning regarding the reliability of any timeline the prosecution might present." Mrs. Venables, who had maintained a rigid posture throughout this exchange, now permitted herself the slightest exhalation, as though a burden previously unendurable had been marginally lightened. Edmund remained motionless, as though afraid that any movement might disrupt whatever delicate equilibrium Wimsey had established. The rain continued its rhythmic assault upon the windows, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour with a measured solemn. "Itty appropriate to a house in which death had visited with such deliberate violence. I believe," Wimsey continued, addressing Harrington with the tone one might employ when explaining a particularly complex mathematical principle to a reasonably intelligent pupil, that the most productive course of action would be to conduct a considerably more extensive investigation into Mr. Ashworth's personal affairs. A man who maintained such elaborate systems of control over his household, who deliberately manipulated temporal perception, who engaged in what appears to have been systematic psychological torture of his nephew, such a man almost certainly possessed secrets of considerably greater magnitude than domestic tyranny. His financial records, his correspondence, any documentation regarding his dealings with persons outside this household, these matters warrant thorough examination. Harrington seized upon this suggestion with the desperation of a drowning man spotting driftwood. "You believe the motive may lie elsewhere? That this was not, in fact, a crime of passion rooted in familial discord? I believe that crimes are frequently more complex than they initially appear," Wimsey replied, "and that rushing toward conclusions, however convenient, frequently obscures rather than illuminates the deeper truth. Mr. Ashworth's relationship with his nephew was certainly troubled, certainly rife with psychological cruelty. But whether such cruelty constituted a sufficiently proximate cause for murder remains considerably more ambiguous than your initial investigation suggested. There may be other parties with motive. There may be financial disputes of which the household remains unaware. There may be professional rivalries, romantic entanglements, or matters of honor that fall outside the domestic sphere entirely. You're suggesting I should investigate beyond the household?" Harrington asked, his voice carrying the tone of a man being directed toward considerably more labor than he had anticipated. "I am suggesting nothing," Wimsey said, now moving toward the desk and examining the scattered papers upon its surface with renewed attention. "However, I observe that Mr. Ashworth maintained a considerable correspondence. These letters, whilst ostensibly regarding matters of business and property management, may contain reference to situations or individuals capable of generating sufficient animus to warrant violence. The presence of a marble paperweight in a drawing room is scarcely remarkable, but the specific selection of such a weapon suggests either opportunity, the object was at hand, or deliberate forethought, the selection of an appropriate instrument. I find myself curious regarding when this particular paperweight was acquired, under what circumstances, and whether it held any particular significance for either the deceased or potential suspects." Bates, seizing what appeared to be his moment, produced a relevant detail with admirable precision. "The paperweight was acquired by Mr. Ashworth approximately 3 years ago, Constable. He received it as a gift from a gentleman he had engaged in a property dispute with some years previously. The dispute had been settled in Mr. Ashworth's favor, and the paperweight was apparently intended as a gesture of reconciliation or perhaps acknowledgement of defeat. Mr. Ashworth maintained it upon his desk continuously from that date forward, though I recall him remarking more than once that the weight of it seemed to increase with the passage of time. A curious observation, Whimsy murmured, his tone suggesting that curiosity, whilst occasionally productive, frequently led one down unproductive paths. And this gentleman, the one with whom Mr. Ashworth had engaged in a property dispute, did he maintain any subsequent contact with the household? Did he visit Ashworth Manor at any point following the settlement of their dispute? Not to my knowledge, sir, Bates replied, though I understand that Mr. Ashworth received correspondence from him approximately 6 months ago, correspondence that Mr. Ashworth appeared to find deeply distressing. He burned the letter in the fireplace without reading it entirely, which was most irregular for him. Mr. Ashworth was customarily meticulous regarding his papers. Harrington's notebook was now acquiring considerably more notation, and his expression had shifted from frustrated confusion toward something approaching engaged interest. "Do we possess a name for this gentleman?" he inquired. "Any documentation regarding the original property dispute?" "Such matters would presumably be contained within Mr. Ashworth's personal correspondence and legal files," Whimsy observed, moving toward the door with the air of a man whose investigation had achieved its intended objective. "I suspect, Constable, that if you examine these materials with appropriate diligence, you may discover that the murder of Mr. Ashworth is considerably less a crime of family passion and considerably more a matter of professional enmity or financial revenge. The locked room, the impossible circumstances. Such theatrical elements frequently serve to obscure rather than illuminate the true perpetrator's identity. I have found, throughout my admittedly limited experience with criminal matters, that the most convincing disguises are frequently the simplest ones: misdirection, temporal confusion, and the natural human tendency to assume that obvious suspects are necessarily guilty suspects." Constable Harrington departed with considerably more purpose than he had displayed upon his arrival, his notebook now bristling with observations and potential avenues of investigation that promised to occupy his attention for weeks to come. The household settled into a peculiar silence following his exit, a silence so profound that it seemed to acquire physical substance, pressing down upon the assembled company like the weight of secrets finally permitted to surface. Edmund had begun to comprehend, albeit imperfectly, that Whimsy had constructed a narrative so thoroughly intricate that the distinction between truth and fabrication had become entirely obscured. Mrs. Venables remained standing with the rigid composure of a woman who had survived a crisis through means she scarcely understood and did not entirely approve of, her expression suggesting profound gratitude mingled with considerable moral discomfort. "The gamekeeper's cottage," Whimsy said quietly, addressing no one in particular, but clearly directing his observation toward Mrs. Venables. "I should think that Miss Catherine would require certain articles before undertaking any extended residence there. Clothing, perhaps, toiletries, documents, should she require them. The journey from the manor to that location traverses somewhat isolated terrain, and one would require considerable knowledge of the grounds to accomplish it without leaving traces. You have, I presume, arranged matters with appropriate discretion?" "She cannot remain indefinitely," Mrs. Venables replied, her voice carrying the weight of grim practicality. "Eventually, the constabulary will widen their investigation, and they will discover her presence." "What then, Lord Peter? You have successfully obscured the immediate truth, but you have not resolved the fundamental difficulty. A woman has killed a man, and the law requires that such acts be prosecuted regardless of the circumstances that precipitated them." "The law requires," Whimsy corrected gently, "that such acts be prosecuted only when the evidence permits prosecution. Constable Harrington is now engaged in investigating alternative scenarios, alternative suspects, alternative motives. By the time his investigation concludes, and such investigations frequently consume considerable time, particularly when they involve examining financial records and correspondence, a rather curious thing may occur. The immediate evidence against Miss Catherine will have become sufficiently contaminated, sufficiently complicated by alternative theories and temporal inconsistencies, that her culpability will appear considerably less certain than it currently appears. Furthermore, should Constable Harrington discover a plausible alternative suspect, a gentleman with whom Mr. Ashworth had previously engaged in disputes, a man with documented grievance and potential access to the manor, the investigation may naturally gravitate toward that individual. Edmund raised his head, his expression a curious mixture of hope and horror. "You're suggesting that an innocent man might be charged with my uncle's murder? That we might accomplish Catherine's protection by sacrificing someone else?" "I am suggesting nothing of the sort," Wimsey replied with characteristic precision. "I am observing that investigations frequently terminate when a plausible suspect emerges, and that the distinction between plausibility and guilt frequently remains eternally ambiguous. Should Constable Harrington discover that the gentleman in question possessed opportunity, perhaps he visited the manor at some point, perhaps he maintained correspondence with Mr. Ashworth, perhaps he possessed knowledge of the household's layout, then the investigation may naturally focus upon him. Whether the evidence would prove sufficient for prosecution remains an entirely separate matter." Bates had been listening to this exchange with the intensity of a man engaged in rapid calculation, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality of almost mathematical precision. "There is no such gentleman, is there, Lord Peter? The property dispute, the letter received 6 months ago, the paperweight as a gift. I fabricated these details at your implicit suggestion. The paperweight was acquired by Mr. Ashworth 20 years ago from a London merchant. The letters upon the desk contain nothing remotely suggestive of grievance or dispute. I have constructed, under your direction, an entirely spurious narrative designed to direct Constable Harrington's investigation toward non-existent suspects. You have observed facts with considerable clarity and presented them in a manner susceptible to alternative interpretation," Wimsey replied. "Which is to say that you have behaved precisely as any reasonable person might behave when confronted with questions regarding matters that happen to fall within your sphere of observation. If Constable Harrington chooses to interpret these observations in a particular manner, that choice remains his own. I have merely suggested that the available evidence admits of multiple interpretations, which is, after all, a statement of objective truth." Edmund had begun to tremble again, though this time the trembling appeared rooted in something other than fear. "This is monstrous," he whispered. "You're advocating for the perversion of justice itself. My uncle was a cruel man, yes, but he was also a man. He deserved better than this. Better than having his murder converted into a mechanism for protecting others. Better than having his death become merely an instrument of manipulation." Wimsey turned toward the young man with an expression of surprising gentleness. "Your uncle," he said quietly, "spent 5 years engaging in deliberate psychological torture of you and your wife. He intercepted your correspondence. He engaged in actions cally designed to isolate you from society and from happiness. He attempted, through systematic cruelty, to destroy not merely your financial prospects, but your sense of self and dignity. He was, by any reasonable definition, engaged in a form of violence considerably more profound than the physical violence that ultimately ended his life. The law, you see, recognizes physical violence readily enough, but it remains remarkably blind to psychological violence, to systematic cruelty, to the destruction of human dignity through means that leave no physical marks. Your wife defended herself against physical violence. Whether she struck harder than necessary, whether her blow was delivered in self-defense or revenge, these remain eternally ambiguous questions. The law does not function well when confronted with such ambiguity. Justice, however, sometimes requires that we accept ambiguity as preferable to pursuing certainty at the cost of destroying innocent lives. The rain had begun to abate, reducing itself from a relentless assault to a mere persistent drizzle, and the drawing-room of Ashworth Manor had acquired that particular quality of exhausted stillness that follows upon genuine emotional upheaval. Edmund had retreated into a silence born not of fear but of moral confusion, the comfortable certainties of his youth having been comprehensively dismantled by exposure to the infinitely more complex realities of justice, law, and the murky territories that separated them. Mrs. Venables had withdrawn to her customary duties, though her movements carried a quality of mechanical precision, as though her body continued to function whilst her mind remained suspended in contemplation of consequences not yet fully manifest. Wimsey himself had installed himself in the library, ostensibly to examine Mr. Ashworth's correspondence, though in reality he appeared to be engaged in the considerably more abstract pursuit of staring out the window whilst nursing a brandy with the philosophical dedication appropriate to a man who had just participated in the deliberate construction of judicial obfuscation. It was James who eventually approached him, moving with the uncertain gait of one unsure whether his presence would be welcomed or dismissed with characteristic whimsy irony. The young footman bore in his expression the weight of his complicity, the knowledge that he had contributed to the obscuring of truth and the misdirection of legitimate investigation, and yet also something resembling relief, as though the burden of maintaining pretense had been lifted from his shoulders. "She's safe," James said quietly. "I took the liberty of riding to the gamekeeper's cottage an hour ago. Miss Catherine is settled, and Mrs. Venables has arranged for supplies to be delivered discreetly. The gamekeeper himself remains ignorant of her presence, believing the cottage to be merely undergoing repairs." "How admirably thorough," Wimsey replied, his tone suggesting neither approval nor disapproval but merely the detached observation of facts presented for consideration. "And young Mr. Edmund? Does he comprehend the precarious nature of Miss Catherine's situation, the manner in which her safety now depends upon the investigation following a particular trajectory toward a particular alternative suspect who does not, in fact, exist?" "He does," James confirmed, "though I suspect he will require considerable time to reconcile himself to the means by which that safety has been achieved. He is not accustomed to moral ambiguity, Lord Peter. The world, as presented to him by his uncle and by conventional society, operated according to relatively uncomplicated principles of right and wrong, lawful and unlawful. You have demonstrated to him that such principles frequently inadequate when confronted with the actual complexity of human motivation and circumstance." Wimsey turned from the window, and something in his expression suggested that James had touched upon matters of genuine weight. "The young frequently possess such illusions," he observed. "It is one of the less fortunate aspects of youth, this conviction that the world operates according to comprehensible principles, that justice and law are aligned, that moral clarity is achievable if one merely applies sufficient rigor to one's ethical reasoning. Experience, unfortunately, teaches rather different lessons. The world is considerably messier than Edmund's previous existence has suggested. Law and justice frequently pursue divergent paths. Moral clarity proves elusive when confronted with situations in which all available choices result in some degree of suffering or injustice." "Will your plan succeed?" James inquired, his voice carrying the tentative quality of one asking a question to which he feared the answer might be devastating. "Will Constable Harrington actually discover this alternative suspect, or will he eventually return to his original theory regarding young Mr. Edmund?" "That," Wimsey said, returning his attention to the window, "remains considerably dependent upon factors outside my direct control. Constable Harrington possesses sufficient intelligence, when properly directed, to recognize the alternative avenues of investigation that present themselves. Whether he possesses the temperament to pursue those avenues with genuine diligence, or whether he will eventually allow convenience to triumph over thoroughness, such matters remain eternally uncertain. However, I have constructed the narrative in such a manner that pursuing the alternative theories requires considerably less effort than extracting a confession from young Mr. Edmund would demand." Harrington W. will eventually conclude that further investigation serves no productive purpose, and at that juncture, the matter will gradually recede from public attention. A year hence, this will be regarded as merely another unsolved murder, another case where justice remained beyond the magistrate's reach. James nodded slowly, as though attempting to absorb the full implications of what Wimsey had constructed. "And Miss Catherine, what becomes of her eventually? "That depends entirely upon the decisions made by Miss Catherine and young Mr. Edmund," Whimsy replied. "She might, if they prove sufficiently discreet and sufficiently patient, eventually depart from the gamekeeper's cottage and establish a new life under circumstances requiring no further reference to the unfortunate events that occurred in this drawing-room. Alternatively, they might conclude that remaining hidden is preferable to the risks attendant upon attempting to build a life together in a society that would regard them with considerable suspicion, considerable judgment. Either way, they possess something that they would not have possessed had I simply permitted Constable Harrington to pursue his original investigation. They possess time. Time to determine their own course, time to establish their own terms for existence, time to construct a future that does not begin with imprisonment and trial. As afternoon dissolved into evening, and the servants commenced their preparation of dinner as though death had not visited the manor. Only that morning, Whimsy sat in the library surrounded by Mr. Ashworth's correspondence and contemplated the curious nature of justice, morality, and the infinitely complex relationship between them. The letters revealed, upon close examination, a man of systematic cruelty, a man who had maintained grievances for decades, a man for whom the exercise of power over others represented the primary source of meaning in an otherwise empty existence. Such a man, Whimsy reflected, deserved whatever fate befell him, though whether Catherine's blow delivered that fate, or whether something else had occurred, remained, quite deliberately, eternally ambiguous. In the end, ambiguity itself became protection. Protection for Catherine, protection for Edmund, protection for everyone caught within the machinery of a legal system that frequently functioned better when it remained thoroughly confused regarding the facts it was meant to adjudicate. Whimsy raised his glass in a solitary toast to the curious intersection of justice and its systematic evasion, then departed the manor the following morning without further word,